Hello and welcome to the Open News. In today's episode we're going to be covering everything from Microsoft developing its own Linux operating system to Feral Interactive releasing a piece of game optimization software for Linux. All that and more right now on Linux Lounge. Well, first up we have this. Microsoft's newest OS is based on Linux. Well, recently it's become apparent Microsoft are looking to become involved in the open source world, doing everything from becoming a member of the Linux Foundation to adding a Linux sort of cheroot to Windows. Well, recently Microsoft have decided to create a whole new operating system based around their sort of modified Linux kernel. It's apparently called Azure Sphere. Now, this is primarily going to be for Internet of Things devices, but I can imagine Microsoft at some point making a Linux OS for more sort of technical desktop users. I can imagine they would, since moving forward, desktop Linux is their biggest threat, since in the future I can imagine Microsoft's market share will consist mostly of more advanced users that could easily switch to Linux, since less advanced users will in the future just use smartphones, tablets, Chromebooks, that kind of thing. Microsoft having their own Linux OS would, in theory, ensure that if anyone were to switch to Linux, they'd most likely switch to their Linux. Now, this is all speculation, and Microsoft have no plans to currently develop a Linux desktop OS at the moment. But if they have the kernel and all the core software, why wouldn't they really? They could still make money from it in the same way they do with Windows 10 by selling services, collecting user data and that sort of thing. Speaking of collecting user data, many of you may be wondering, this is a Microsoft product, it must have some sort of telemetry. Well, by many accounts it does collect information relating to the state of the device it's running on. Now, you may think that Microsoft could never get away with telemetry on open source software. Well, it wouldn't necessarily have to be open source. There are ways and means around the GPL. So, really, a Microsoft-powered Internet of Things device, it truly could be a real nightmare after all. Well, next up we have this. Linux Deepin may possibly be spyware. Well, this is a shame. Recently some Deepin users have found the store app in Deepin OS makes connections to cnzz.com, a advertising service similar-ish to Google Analytics. Now, this data collection has been found on the website that the Deepin store uses as a backend. The data collected includes, browser user agent, screen resolution, and things like that. According to Deepin, this information is collected to improve website experience. So in theory, this connection really is just standard data collection used on pretty much every website. However, despite the fact that it isn't truly malicious, I would still argue this kind of data collection has no place in open source software. It doesn't really help that Deepin OS has already been accused of having, poor security and being sort of spyware. Now, Deepin themselves have released an official statement on this whole situation, claiming this data collection wasn't malicious and is in fact quite normal. No private information was collected, thankfully. But honestly, I think with this situation and many others, I would personally just advise you to use Manjaro Deepin or something like that if you're worried in the slightest about data collection or running possibly vulnerable software. It's a shame to see such a nice distro make a mistake like this, to be honest. Well, next up we have this. Gamemode is a new tool that can improve gaming performance on Linux. Well, a rather interesting little piece of software has just been released. Gamemode pretty much is what it sounds like. It's a cool little program which will allow software to request your CPU and other hardware to run in some kind of a performance mode. Now, as you would imagine, this boosts performance in games and, other software like that, at the expense of some power usage. But interestingly enough, it can actually be useful for video editing and other sort of high-end software like that. Now, how much does it actually boost game performance? Well, I've seen all kinds of tests showing a 10 FPS or more increase in game performance and improvements in video editors, sort of like Kdenlive and that. And who's developing this? only Feral Interactive, the same company that are bringing Rise of the Tomb Raider to Linux, so no wonder it's such a great piece of software. Well, finally we have this, Rise of the Tomb Raider Linux System Requirements. Well, after a bit of a wait, the release date for Rise of the Tomb Raider on Linux has been announced, April 19th. But not only that, the system requirements have also been announced. To run this game, you'll need Ubuntu 17.10 or later. Honestly, it surprises me that it won't run on Ubuntu 16.04, but I suppose the new LTS release is coming out quite soon now. An Intel Core i3-4130T, or AMD equivalent, a 2GB AMD R9 285 or 2GB GTX 1060, and 28GB of storage. So all in all, pretty reasonable requirements. I must say I'm really looking forward to this port and seeing how well the Vulkan API can perform with this game. If it's anywhere near as good as the Mac version, it will be a great port. Combined with the new Gamemode tool, we'll have one seriously great port of this game on our hands. Well, that's all we have time for today, but before I go, I'd like to put this in as the fun little extra. This here is a screenshot from the new Maze Runner film, Death Cure. As you can see, the desktop on this display will look astonishingly recognisable to anyone that's run Ubuntu for any period of time. It would appear they're using an Ubuntu system with the Unity desktop. To fake hacking, they simply ran @get update. Yeah, there's something strangely